But let's dive in here. We are today doing, again, a 101 session, Water Quality Standards 101, talking about one of the very core and fundamental programs of the Federal Clean Water Act and how that the Federal Clean Water Act gets interpreted and kind of implemented at the state level and in your watershed at home. So Water Quality Standards 101 is the order of the day. We are going to move through an agenda here that's pretty basic. We'll have an introduction to the issue and some background, talk briefly about why water quality standards are so critical, and then we're going to talk about the three core pieces of water quality standards one by one. So we'll dive into those three pieces in a little more detail as we move through them, and then again wrap up with some resources that would let you dive into these issues in a little more detail, maybe look at what some of these concepts mean in your state, get additional training, those types of follow-up activities. So hopefully that was what you signed up for, why you're here today, is to get this very basic introduction. With that, I'll just jump right into that introduction section of the agenda. And after this introduction will be the first time that I open up for questions. So if you want to be chatting them as we go or just thinking, taking notes, prepare for the first opportunity to break in with questions. So to give you a little background here, I always like to start any of our presentations, particularly the 101s, with some very basic connections to the overall Clean Water Act. So the Clean Water Act is our federal statute that is the main piece of legislation, the main law of the land in terms of water quality protection and restoration. It applies all across the country, and the original idea back in 1972 was largely to establish a level playing field across the country. The idea being that you shouldn't be able to shop around to find a state that was willing to give you a deal on pollution control and create, more or less sacrifice zones around the country. So the Clean Water Act establishes this national floor of protection. States are able to go above that floor, but the idea is, again, to have some consistency around the country. When we talk about water quality standards, I like to tie it to one of the goals that's listed in the Act. They have a series of pretty lofty, pretty visionary goals in the Act, in the original text. And this one is particularly applicable to what we're talking about today. You can see here that what they did was set a goal that said, wherever attainable, the Act was going to strive to protect water quality that would provide for protection of essentially, fish, aquatic life, fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and also provide for recreation in and on the water. So we're looking at kind of aquatic life and wildlife and human uses, and they actually set a deadline for that. They said all of our waters, again, wherever attainable, should meet these goals by July 1st, 1983. And anybody who works in this field will know that we haven't achieved that goal. We definitely didn't achieve it by 1983, and we're still not there. But that is still kind of the standing law of the land in terms of the goal. And when we talk about water quality standards, I think you'll see as we talk through this session here how much the vision of water quality standards and kind of the goals that are set under water quality standards really tie back to this overarching goal of protection of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water. So the way you often hear this in shorthand, this goal, you may have heard people say that the goal is for fishable and swimmable waters. That's an easy way to remember this Clean Water Act goal. It does it a little bit of an injustice in that it's not really just about being able to drop a hook in the water and catch a fish. It's really about, well, as it says here, protection and propagation of all the things in the water, including fish. And one of the side benefits might be that we can catch it, but it's really about that ecosystem and the aquatic life. And again, swimmable is shorthand for the recreation in and on the water. So that's just a little bit of context for what we'll be talking about today. When we look at the details of water quality standards, what we're talking about is our subject today. We go to the federal regulations. That's what this citation is here. It's the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR. And the language in the CFR that introduces the concept of water quality standards talks about two pieces that are going to go into this standard. And we'll talk about each of these as well as a third piece that is included in the concept of standard, even though it's not described here. So those two pieces are, they say, we're going to designate the use or uses to be made of our waters, and then we're going to set criteria that would protect those uses. So a couple important things here. As human beings, when we think about a standard, we usually are thinking about some kind of measuring stick, a number that you're above or below, or a range, some sort of standard that you're trying to achieve. And that's really that criteria piece that's listed here. But equally important is the designated use. And as we talk about each of these, I want you to think about how important the interaction between the two things really are. So here they say we're going to designate the uses and then set criteria to protect those uses. So I'll go through each of these in more detail a little later in the presentation, but that's just to give you some background. The third piece that isn't referenced here that we're going to talk about is the anti-degradation policy and implementation procedures. And again, we'll go into detail on each of those three as we talk. So before we get into that nitty-gritty of what we mean by designating uses and setting criteria and then this anti-degradation idea, a little more background. The first question that often comes to mind is, well, who sets these water quality standards? Who's in charge? The Clean Water Act is, a federal statute. As I said, it's kind of the national floor or law of the land for water quality. But it's set up in many of its programs in such a way that a lot of the programmatic day-to-day work is really done by the states or tribes. So although there's a federal kind of consistency effort, a lot of the day-to-day work is done at the more local level. So the way this works with standards and several other programs is, generally speaking, the states or tribes, where applicable, will set water quality standards. So as we talk about designating the uses or setting water quality criteria, as we talk through these pieces, usually that work is in the state and tribal hands. However, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency still sets the policy, recommends criteria as we talk about water quality criteria, and retains oversight of standards. And what that oversight means in part is they review what the states and tribes do and have the authority to approve or disapprove of what's been done. So that U.S. EPA role is part of what keeps that idea of a federal consistency or floor in place. As applied, it's not as perfectly consistent as you might think, but that is the concept behind this tiered approach of, doing the work at the state level and then having this federal oversight that maintains some consistency. In addition, however, the Water Quality Standards Program requires extensive public input and involvement in the process of setting the standards we're going to talk about and changing them. So in a way, you can think of the public or watershed groups or others as part of the entity that develops standards. We might not be developing, the number for the chlorine concentration, but we have a role in responding to, providing input about, et cetera, each of these pieces as they're developed or as they're proposed to be changed. So that's one of the reasons why we at River Network have talked a lot about the Clean Water Act in general, and particularly water quality standards, is they do have such a great hook for people who are interested in protecting or restoring their local waters. So we noticed when we looked at the RSVP list that we had a lot of tribal representatives who had RSVP'd for this call. So I wanted to take a second to just talk a little bit about how the tribal role works on water quality standards. This is a whole training or trainings in and of itself, but I wanted to at least provide a little bit of information. And even for those of you who aren't part of a tribal government or entity, it might be worth knowing this if you have tribes in your state that you might want to work with. So just as the states can choose to take on the Water Quality Standards Program and implement it at the local level, tribes can as well. This is a concept called treatment in the same manner as state. That's how they address it in the regulations. And there's a lot of reasons why a tribe might want to take this on. As the local, the people who are on the ground and know the rivers, just like at the state level, the state might know more about their waters than US EPA does. Similarly, the tribal government might be much more well-informed about what's going on with their waters. And so we'll be better able to work to develop and then update the pieces of standards we're going to talk about. So they might be better at identifying and protecting uses. They can set standards which are stricter than the state that they're within or different than the state that they're within. And it can also provide them some handles for taking on other pieces of the Clean Water Act that allow a similar kind of role for the states and or the tribes to take on. So there's lots of reasons why a tribal government might want to take on the Water Quality Standards Program, and in fact many have. I have a slide here that's just an example, and in fact, it may need to be updated, but this is from some work of training I did with the New Mexico Pueblos several years ago now, and you can see that there were quite a few that had already taken on the Water Quality Standards Program within the state of New Mexico. So they were running their own Water Quality Standards Program and able to make decisions about their local waters. So again, I mentioned this earlier, if a tribe wants to take on the Water Quality Standards Program, it's not dissimilar to a state doing this kind of work, but there is a process that the tribe goes through working with their regional EPA usually to develop their standards and get this approval to be treated in the same manner as the state for water quality. People are interested in this, at the end of the webinar today, we'll have an evaluation form, and one of the things you can do is suggest additional topics for webinars. And again, this could be a webinar in and of itself, and feel free to note that you would be interested in that, and it would be something that we'd be happy to develop. I can also share some resources from US EPA and elsewhere that would help folks thinking about maybe going down this route. But I wanted to at least acknowledge that this is a real option for tribes, just as it is something the states take on, the tribal governments can. So going back to the more general introduction, I alluded to the fact that there's a lot of public involvement in establishing or changing water quality standards. This slide mentions a few of those options for public involvement. The main one that you may have heard about is called the triennial review. It is required in the federal regulations that states review their water quality standards from time to time, but at least every 3 years. That's why it's called the triennial review, every 3 years. In reality, this has not historically happened every 3 years, and in fact has stretched to 12 or longer in some states. States, however, do seem to be doing these on a much more regular basis these days than previously. But there's a very official kind of public notice and comment period. You can get in contact with your state agency and usually get on some sort of notice list, and they will let you know when they're thinking about proposing changes, and you can be involved in the process. You could also at any point petition the state to make a change to their water quality standards. That's just kind of a legal process that is always available to a watershed group or other interested party who would like to see something changed. And then the second bullet here is about more specific change ideas that you might hear about. This is a little more intermediate to advanced, but you may hear people talk about things such as a use attainability analysis, which is the process that's used to change uses that we'll talk about here shortly. You might hear about site-specific standards. There's several mechanisms in the policy for tweaking standards that aren't the full triennial review, or that might be part of the triennial review, but focused on a specific area like a changing a designated use. So the important thing to take away from this slide is there's regular opportunities for public input through the triennial review, and there's a big role for that public input, whether it's through the triennial review or the petition, in terms of providing information to the state, particularly local information, site-specific information, etc. And I'll talk about those as we go through the rest of the presentation here. I'll try to highlight some of those ideas for input. So with that, I think, I was going to talk quickly about why before we do questions. Why is this such a critical program? A lot of you, if you're here, probably have some idea of the answer to this question already. If you were curious enough to be on a webinar, you know that water quality standards are important. And the reason is that so many other Clean Water Act programs and programs beyond the Clean Water Act really rely on having good, strong, appropriate water quality standards in place. So whether you're a volunteer monitoring group that is, just wanting to make sure that your monitoring is relevant and useful to the state agency, that would be important to really understand your water quality standards in terms of your monitoring design and where you might target monitoring or how often you monitor. All of that should be informed by water quality standards. All the way to, if you're looking at a point source discharge permit like a wastewater treatment plant or an industrial facility, their permit limits are going to rely in part on what water quality standards are in place in your watershed. If you're involved in the TMDL, the Total Maximum Daily Load Restoration process under the Clean Water Act, these water quality standards are really what drives drive the goal of the TMDL. What is going to be considered restored is usually defined very directly by your water quality standards. So those are just a few reasons. There's many more. Some are on this slide, and there's other programs and policies that really rely on having strong and appropriate standards in place. So we can talk more about that in Q&A if people are curious, but it really is the fundamental underlying program of the Act. So with that, here's our first opportunity for questions. You can, if you're on the phone, you can hit *6 to unmute yourself and ask a question verbally, or there's a chat box on your screen. I guess it's on the left-hand side of your screen. You can use that to enter a question. And I've been talking a lot, so please pipe up if you have a question. Total silence either means everyone is asleep or I've been so thorough that there's not a question out there. I don't even see that anyone's typing in the chat, so I'm going to keep going. But again, feel free to enter questions at any point while I'm talking into that chat window. And again, if it's on your mind, it's probably on somebody else's mind or will be when they're listening to the recording. So feel free to pipe up. But we'll move ahead here and get into the heart of the presentation. So that introduction gave you a little bit of background, but I was using some terms that we haven't totally defined, and that's what we're going to do here in the next couple of sections. I'm going to talk about each of the three pieces of water quality standards in a little more detail. The first is designated uses, talked about on that first regulatory slide. The second piece is water quality criteria, which are, again, remember, very much associated with those uses. And then we're going to talk about this kind of other creature, the anti-degradation policy. Also a very important component of water quality standards, but quite a different creature from the first two pieces. So let's start with designated uses. I think that this is just a kind of mind-boggling concept for a federal statute. But designated uses are established in the regulations. Again, I've tried to provide regulatory sites here if you all want to dig in deeper. But the regulations say that designated uses are those uses in the water quality standards, so that's in your state's official policies or the tribe's official policies, that for each water body or segment are the uses that we want to achieve. So whether or not they're currently being attained, they can be goal statements. So it might be a place where we want to be able to swim safely, even if right now that's not actually a safe thing to do. We can establish that as a designated use because it's something we want for our water body, kind of a goal. So a couple important things from this, gobbledygook of regulatory language. I just touched on one. These uses can be established whether or not they're currently being attained. So it's important to keep in mind. Again, they can be the current status quo or a goal for your water. Another important thing to take away here is that they are specified for each water body or segment. So this is what kind of blows my mind is they're very local. They're very specific. It's part of the reason why delegating this program to the state or tribal governments makes sense. If you think about all those waters around your, even just your watershed, but think of the whole state, each of those has some designated use, or in most cases, several designated uses associated with it. And those are recorded in your regulations. And what it means by water body or segment is sometimes it's the whole, say the whole river or an entire lake, and sometimes it's a portion. There might be a 10-mile stretch of river that supports trout, while some of there's a 20-mile stretch that is more of a warm water fishery for bass. We'll talk more about how those get designated. But it can be a piece of a water body or the entire water body, but they're going to have some uses associated for any water that's out there. Your state may have default uses that apply to any non-designated waters, but they do have those uses. So that's designated uses, and let's talk about a few examples here. So I'm going to try to get you guys to use chat, so get your typing fingers ready. I wonder if there's anybody out there that can tell me an example of a designated use from their state. So something that your state uses, or your tribe, as a designated use. And I'll get the ball rolling with one from my state here in Utah. We have, what do we have? What would be one that wouldn't give away too many others? We have a cold water fishery use. I've already talked about that. So cold water, actually we call them game fish, which is not very scientifically based. But we have a cold water fishery use designation. So that would again be trout and those types of fish that need that nice cool. Does anybody either want to *6 their phone to unmute or use the chat function to share a designated use for your state? Somebody unmute. Anybody want to pipe up? Wow, this is a very shy crowd. We have 50 people on, and no one has an example of a designated use. All right, well, I will break and give you guys the examples here. So here's some typical examples that you'll see. Well, the bottom one isn't typical, but a lot of states will have something like a cold water fishery and a warm water fishery. Some states will break that down into much more detail as to the quality of the fishery or different types of fish. Some sort of fishery, aquatic life designation. Again, those get back to that goal that we started with of the Clean Water Act of the fishable and swimmable. This would be something that would tie back to the idea of a fishable water. The second one would actually tie to the swimmable idea. You'll see in many states designations like primary contact recreation, and that's horrible legalese language for activities where you immerse yourself, swimming being the obvious example. Some states have an associated category called secondary contact recreation, which is more about, say, wading and splashing kind of activities where you might not immerse your head. But most states have some version of swimming or primary contact recreation, something that ties back to that swimmable goal. The other bullets you see here are ones you may or may not have. Here in Utah, we do have agricultural and irrigation designated use, and a lot of states have some version of that. You'll often also see domestic water supply, so places where a municipality is drawing their water supply from. And in some cases, you may see ceremonial uses. This might be true in some tribal water quality standards. I've seen this come up. And I've also heard talk about it in some, I think it was a southern state. It's kind of escaping me, but it was for baptismal use. People were going to be immersing their head, essentially, kind of like swimming, through baptisms, and so wanted that protection in place of the designated use for that. So those are just examples. One of the things to do as you get to know more about standards in your state is to really make sure you understand the uses that you have and which ones are appropriate in your watershed, which ones you might want to apply or use in your watershed. There's just a list of examples. Again, they vary in language, et cetera, from state to state. Some states have 4 or 5 uses, and some will have 10 or 12 because they break these into smaller categories. Okay, well, I'm starting to see some chats come through. I think we were having another technical glitch there. Sorry. So I see that people have been talking here about 401. Yeah, sorry, I didn't describe each of the examples on that why critical slide because it's more intermediate to advanced. I'm trying to see here if there's other questions here. Let's see an example of a non-designated use. We'll talk about that a little bit in a second. There's not really such a thing as a non-designated use, but I'm going to talk about a concept called existing uses that might help with that. So I'll circle back around, and if that does not answer your question when we get there, please let me know. I think that is up and running now on my screen. Okay, so here's an example of this designated use idea from Michigan. So there's a lot of text on the slide, I know, but I wanted you guys to see the actual way that these regulations look so that they're not quite so intimidating when you go to look at your own. So this is pulled right out of Michigan's regulations. They run their water quality standards program. And there's a couple things I wanted to point out here. The first is this first little red box is surrounding some text that shows that one of the things that Michigan does here is establish a list of uses that apply to all their water bodies. So it's kind of like a default protection, right? So A through G, all of those uses apply to all of their water bodies. Agriculture is an example we talked about. We didn't talk about navigation. You can see partial body contact recreation, that's that wading designation I mentioned, and several others there. So that's kind of the default list. But then you can see as the regulations go on, they talk about some additional uses that are designated in certain situations. So the second red box here is looking at some places where what they call total body contact recreation, which would be swimming, again, kind of immersion type of things, that apply seasonally. You know, Michigan's a cold state, so they apply it during the season where people might, I suppose, be swimming. And they talk in more detail about how that's going to work. But the idea here is there's all the surface waters of the state are protected for that swimming, kind of swimmable use during a season. So I thought that was interesting. You might see something like that in your state. And then as you read down further, they talk about which lakes will, in addition to the uses that are assigned by default, also be protected for cold water fisheries. So you can see here they reference a document that identifies all the cold water lakes of Michigan. And then they just incorporate that into their standards as the list of waters protected for the designated fisheries. So I'm going to pause here and look at the chat because there's been some more questions. Let me see here. There's more of a statement. Oh, so in Oklahoma, so some people here are now sharing some of the uses. Looks like they're very similar, if you all can see the chat window, to some of the examples we've talked about. Emily asked, what does use protected mean in reference to beneficial uses? I believe, Emily, you might be from Colorado. If that's right, let me know. That's kind of a term of art in Colorado. And then Anne says, is there any official or federal consistency to the definitions of different types of designated uses? Yeah, that's a good question. Again, US EPA does review and approve any kind of use classes that the states or tribes set up. So they do have, at the very least, the states have to protect for kind of the fishable and swimmable uses of the act wherever attainable. States have to prove if they're establishing some kind of designated use as the only designated use and not including a fishable, swimmable kind of status for that water. So that's one floor. But also they just generally review and approve of these. So if they were incredibly, if they were not based on data and science for the state, EPA could disprove that idea of that use class. So for example, this hasn't always been shot down, but one of my pet peeves is some states have designated uses that are effluent dominated waters, meaning that most of the water in the river is made up of wastewater flow. To me, that's saying that the use, in quotes, I'm putting this in quotes, is waste transport. And that, to me, is not a Clean Water Act fishable, swimmable kind of use. But in some cases, EPA has accepted those. It really depends on how they're defined, et cetera. So there is that federal review for consistency, but there's not just one definition of, say, what a cold water fishery designated use is, or what a navigation use is. The states define them within reason. I'm going to follow up on the question from Emily. Emily, since you're in Colorado and this is the 101 session, if you'd like, please email me and we'll follow up on the use protected question because it's very specific to Colorado as it's kind of written there. So we should talk about that maybe. Well, so there's an example from Michigan of designated uses. Let's see here. A few things to keep in mind that most of these we've touched on, but they're really worth remembering, is that these designated uses are very local. They're going to be assigned to every water body or even a segment of the water body. And again, they need to include the basic fishable and swimmable goals as designated uses, tying back to that Clean Water Act goal, unless the state proves that those are not attainable. And that's kind of more of an intermediate to advanced topic as to how they do it. But as a default, waste transport is not acceptable as the only designated use for your water. And then there's one more concept that I wanted to touch on. It's a little bit more intermediate, but I thought it was worth talking about today. And that is the states must also protect all what are called existing uses in a water body. This will come up when we talk about anti-degradation, and may come up in other contexts as well. So I'm going to talk about this concept here before we leave designated uses. So this is going to get a little confusing just language-wise, but we talked about designated uses, and those are those uses officially acknowledged in your water quality standards policy. So they're written out as regulation for your state or tribe. And again, they might be current uses of the water, or they might be goals. They might be kind of aspirational goals for what you want to use the waters for. Existing uses are a little bit different, but they're important. So existing uses are those that have existed or have been attained at any point since 1975, kind of an arbitrary date. It's actually a particular date in November of 1975. This is when the regulations kicked in, so it's very arbitrary. But existing uses include those uses actually being made of a water body, whether or not the water quality really supports that use. So an example here would be if you've got a local swimming hole where kids are going to swim because it's the best spot in town to swim, but there's a bacteria problem there. Maybe there's septic systems around the lake in that area, and it actually is violating water quality criteria for bacteria. It's not safe to swim there. That is still an existing use. Those kids are still swimming there. That's a use that's actually being made, or it has been made since 1975. And so that still qualifies as an existing use. Existing use also includes those uses for which adequate water quality exists, but maybe nobody is using the water for that. So using our swimming hole example, maybe there's this great swimming hole that actually has very good quality water. There's no bacteria problem, but it's way out in the kind of boonies like where I grew up, and no kids have even found it yet. But the water quality is good enough to support that use. If people wanted to swim there, it would be safe and good for them to do so. That is also an existing use, whether or not those uses are actually being made. It's a little bit of a kind of riddle, this definition of existing uses. But the important thing to keep in mind, the reason this idea exists is we don't want to see backsliding on water quality. And the Clean Water Act is set up to try to continually move us forward in improvement. So what the idea of an existing use is saying if those uses are either being done or could be done there, we want to protect the existing water quality for those existing uses and not let it degrade, not let it be kind of downgraded over time. So we'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about anti-degradation, but here's a few reasons to care about it, and again, it'll maybe make a little more sense when we talk about anti-degradation. But the idea is, again, it establishes this firm baseline of protection. So an example of this would be, in 1975, let's say you have a nice, healthy fishery in a stream, and it stays that way until 1980. And then there's a chemical spill, and it wipes out the fish population in the stream. The existing use of supporting that fishery is still the baseline for protection. It's still the goal for that river. It's not the new goal of this river that's been totally cleaned out of fish and hence supports, let's say it supports no aquatic life. Forget just the fish, but you've killed off your macroinvertebrates, your bugs as well. It's holding firm on the idea that no, we're not just going to wipe it out and then write it off. We're going to stick with that baseline of protection of what it was in 1975. These other ideas on here are, again, things we'll talk about a little bit more, like anti-degradation or intermediate topics. I just want to at least throw out there this intermediate topic of the use attainability analysis. I mentioned during the public input slides that one way that water quality standards are changed is through this process of the use attainability analysis. What that process does is it allows you to change or remove designated uses. So let's say it was a cold water fishery and you want to change it to a warm water fishery, you would have to go through this use attainability analysis. But existing uses cannot be removed through that process. Again, they are the firm baseline of protection. If there are currently trout in that stream or the water quality to support them, you're not allowed to downgrade the use through use attainability analysis. And a little intermediate, but just something to hold in the back of your mind as you start to wade into the standards world. Existing uses are a baseline of protection. So I think I just wanted to summarize a few things here about what you can do with this information. It's a lot of information, but for watershed groups and others that are on the line, some of the most useful ways that you can get involved in water quality standards relate to uses. The first is just documenting uses in your watershed. People who are living or working in a watershed are going to know much more about how people and wildlife and aquatic life use those resources than even the best intentioned state agency staff person. You're just going to know it better. So by documenting what's really going on and comparing what you know with what's in the water quality standards in the actual policy to see where there's a disconnect is a really valuable service and is the kind of information that you could raise in the triennial review and the other public comment in the introduction section. So that's basically, I would say, the main way in which watershed groups could be useful is that on-the-ground reality check for how these policies are established, particularly if you have default uses that the state's applied. You might find that there's lots of variability in your watershed that just isn't showing up in the water quality standards. Okay, so I've got a question here, which is actually, I think, my next slide. So I'll go ahead and open it up if people want to ask questions. I've got two. So the first is, how do water quality standards apply when you have combined use, i.e. agricultural, municipal, or industrial, or when the existing use is changed, i.e. municipalities buy out agricultural users? That might be by our agriculture. Brett, it sounds like maybe you're talking about water quantity issues for combined use. But when we talk about water quality criteria, I think it will help you see how different uses that are layered over on a water body are applied. Basically, what we do is we protect for the most sensitive use in a water body. And that, what the most sensitive use is not the same in every situation. And I'll show a slide that kind of walks us through that. So if I don't get to the heart of that question, Brett, please speak up again. So now another question here is, how involved is EPA in setting wastewater discharge standards into waters of the state? So this is related to, but a little different than our topic today. This is about point source discharge permits, I think, Rick, the way you've written this. EPA has a similar oversight role in the NPDES, the point source permitting program, where they can review what the state has done in terms of a permit and engage, approve or disapprove what they've done. It's relatively rarely done, but the EPA does have a role at the regional level usually in looking at those permits. And if you want to talk more about that, that might be a good offline question. But those wastewater discharge standards are based on water quality standards often, but are their own kind of world in terms of policy and regulation. Okay, so any other questions here? Oh, here's a question I haven't seen before. Potty break, question mark. You should all feel free to step away. We do just push right through here for these hour-and-a-half webinars because they're quite short. If you need to step away, I will understand. I promise I'm not going to step away. That might be awkward. But if you need to take a break, of course, you always can. All right, so getting to our second piece of water quality standards, so something we've referenced here several times now, is the water quality criteria component. If you remember, if you walk away with one concept from this presentation, I've said several times how closely the designated uses are tied to the water quality criteria. So this little snippet from the regulation makes that point in the first sentence, that states have to adopt the criteria that will protect their designated use, whatever designated use or uses are in place on a river or a lake or wetland. And hopefully getting at Brett's question, the regulation says where you see multiple use designations, the criteria that will kind of rule will be the ones that support the most sensitive use. So you can't kind of pick and choose among the uses and say, oh, irrigation, we're just going to protect for that when you're also supposed to be protecting for primary contact recreation and some kind of quality fisheries. You have to figure out what's the most sensitive use and use those criteria to drive whatever it is you're doing, whether it's setting limits for a discharge permit or establishing a restoration plan. So before we look at some specifics about criteria, I want to get at this most sensitive use question because it comes up a lot, like kind of which one rules. So again, using the chat, if you don't want to speak up, I'm going to just ask a few questions here and see if people can guess. It's not that hard of a situation. The point here is that what the most sensitive use is going to vary depending on what parameter or pollutant you're looking at. So if you've got, let's say that you're concerned about the dissolved oxygen level in your creek, let's say. Which of the designated uses there on the side column do you think would be most sensitive to the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water? A bunch of people here weighing in with cold water fishery, and that is correct. Can I make my little X come up? There it is. That's correct. And if you were concerned about the amount of bacteria in your lake or in your local creek, which designated use do you think might be most sensitive if you're concerned about bacteria? For a sec here. A bunch of people are typing, but it's not a. Here we go. Swimming. I'm seeing swimming, swimming, swimming. Pretty unanimous. Anybody think domestic water supply? You guys are good. It is swimming. Some people, sometimes you might think domestic water supply because we're drinking it, ooh, bacteria. But it's a little bit of a trick question because usually domestic water supply is designated in such a way that it assumes treatment. It assumes that you're going to go through a wastewater treatment plant, and one of the things they treat for is bacteria. So clearly the answer to the third one here, arsenic, is domestic water supply. So you would likely be much more concerned about the arsenic levels in a domestic water supply than if it was a fishery or if you're swimming in it. You're actually drinking it as opposed to just swimming through it. You're going to get dosed with arsenic. So does that help with the questions about most sensitive use? The idea is that it's not, I can't tell you that one use is the most sensitive use. It really is going to depend on what you're protecting and what you're concerned about in your water body. If that doesn't clear up some of those issues, please let me know, and we'll circle back around to this question of most sensitive use. I have a question here. It says, because arsenic is treatable, question mark. It is treatable, but it's still domestic water supply is the most sensitive use of these three for arsenic, whereas bacteria, some people might think it's domestic water supply, but because it's treatable, it really is swimming where you're really ingesting it. It's going in through your nose or mouth, say, when you're swimming, or if the kids open their mouth underwater. Whereas you wouldn't get an equivalent kind of dose of arsenic through swimming. You could get a dangerous dose of bacteria and end up with some GI illness, that kind of thing. All right, well, if there's still questions about that most sensitive use concept, we can address them a little later here when I get to the question slide for criteria. But let's talk quickly about some of the types of criteria that are out there. So there's three main types that you'll hear about. The one that people are usually most familiar with is chemical types of criteria. And these are things like toxic contaminants, metals, those kinds of things that you tend to see. And we'll look at a few examples so you see those chemical contaminants. These are the ones that are probably, there's a million chemicals in the world, so there's always more that could be done, but there's some very defined lists of chemicals. You'll see long lists of them in your water quality standards if you look at your state standards, and they're very specific, very, very measurable kind of water quality criteria. But there's also these other types that you are going to see, and you'll see in some diversity depending on your state. The second is physical, and the third is biological. So physical might include things like temperature or even flow. Those are pretty rare, but the flow in a stream can be a water quality criteria. It can set a minimum or set some kind of flow regime. So very physical concept. You'll also see increasingly biological criteria. States are establishing ways to directly measure the health of, say, macroinvertebrates, the little bugs in the stream, or fish, or even some of the plant kind of assemblages in the water. So these biological criteria are being established in states' water quality standards just in the way that chemical kind of criteria have been more traditionally used. So we're going to look at a few examples here, so hopefully that'll make these clearer. But before we look at the examples, I wanted to point out one other split in terms of types of criteria. So normally when we think about a criterion, we're again thinking about something kind of measurable, a benchmark, a number. And we'll look at examples that'll show, it might be the maximum acceptable amount in a water body. A lot of the toxics or metals, there'll be kind of a maximum acceptable concentration. It might be a minimum acceptable level. The example there would be dissolved oxygen. You want to, for a lot of different aquatic life uses, they will establish a minimum amount at any one time before you're going to start to see real problems with your fish or other aquatic life. Or it might be an acceptable range, like pH. You often will see a range that as long as it's within that range, it meets the criteria. So that's one kind, numeric. That's kind of traditional. It's what we are kind of used to thinking about, again, that measurable idea. But there's an equally powerful idea in the second type of criteria, which are narrative criteria. These describe water quality goals or desirable situations is one way to think about it. And so it might be a desirable biological condition. It might be what we call kind of in shorthand free from standards, and we'll see an example of this. It might be, my favorite is free from floating debris and scum. So it's, instead of saying how much scum is acceptable, there's just a narrative description that says we want it to be free from scum. So these narrative criteria are very useful in that you can, for example, in the scum scenario, you can see it doesn't really lend itself to kind of a measurable benchmark, or it's zero. So free from is a pretty good way to describe what you want. Secondly, there's a lot of things that can be in our water, and it's really basically impossible to set a numeric criterion for each and every parameter or pollutant that might be in the water. So a lot of these narrative standards give us a way to get at concerns that there's not a specific number established for. So, for example, a lot of states say free from toxics and toxic amounts or something along those lines. So if you have a toxic pollutant that isn't listed in your numeric criteria, you still have a way to get at, well, wait, it's there, it's too much, we need to do something about it. So again, we'll look at an example that I think will help make that clearer. Although I'm a big supporter of narrative criteria because they cover things, again, that that need covering and are hard to do in a numeric way, you can probably guess they're a bit of a challenge in terms of implementation. When it comes time to set a wastewater treatment plant's discharge limit or establish a goal for a restoration plan, you're working with this less measurable narrative description and have to translate that into something to make it useful. And again, that's probably more of an intermediate to advanced session. It's important to know that these narrative criteria exist and are powerful. So let's look at some examples here. This is from Ohio's standards, and you don't have the top of this chart. I apologize. But I wanted to use this one because it shows that for one parameter here, the one with the box around it is dissolved oxygen. You have a lot of different numbers here. You can see these are all milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen. And what you have down the left-hand column here with the WWH and the EWH, etc., those are different aquatic life designated uses. So for example, the first one is warm water habitat. The second is exceptional warm water habitat, exceptional habitat. And it kind of goes down the list, modified, etc. And you can see as you read across that they have different criteria in place for how much dissolved oxygen needs to be in the water to support that use. What you don't have here that's a little confusing, but I couldn't make it work with my cut and paste, is the first column with numbers with the 4.0 it starts with 22, but it's 4.0 for dissolved oxygen. That's an average amount. Oh, no, I'm sorry, that's the minimum amount that's allowable in any measurement, and then the next column there is an average amount. So not only do you have different amounts of dissolved oxygen that are appropriate for different designated uses, you have different ways that it's measured. In one case, you're looking at the minimum. In another, you're looking at the average over a certain time period. And your state will probably have some standards that are set this way, some criterion that are set either at an acute and a chronic or a minimum and an average. It's worth spending some time with your standards to figure out how they're really measuring them. So there's just one example here of dissolved oxygen and how it ties to those aquatic life use classes. And this is also from Ohio, just an example of narrative criteria. And you can see here that they're using that free from idea that I mentioned. A lot of states will have some version. This is just a snippet of the list. It goes on after C. And most states will have a long list, something like this. So you see they're talking about suspended solids. They're talking about floating debris, again, oil, scum. They even are talking about, color, odor, other nuisance conditions. So these narrative criteria cover a wide range of things, and again, things that can otherwise perhaps be hard to establish one number for, or even a range of numbers. So hopefully that helps you get a feel for the types of things you might see in the narrative criteria world. And again, I haven't looked at all 50 state standards in details, but I've looked at a lot, and every state that I've ever looked at has some version of this list for narrative criteria, and some get quite specific. So before we get to questions here again, some ideas for taking action on criteria. These can be kind of technical, like as you saw maybe with that chart from the Ohio numeric criteria, it can look a little intimidating. But there's a couple things that even at the 101 level, I think are really important to consider, at least getting familiar with in your standards and maybe engaging with. First is just to review your state's narrative criteria, and then maybe talk to the state agency about, how do we monitor for problems with these? How are they translated into limits for the permits or for restoration plans such as TMD? Those types of things. Just asking some questions about how those are used or not used can be really informative and can be useful in your watershed. Secondly, you might want to really look at the specific criteria for uses you care about in your watershed. So I use the example here of trout fisheries. So say you're part of the local Trout Unlimited chapter, and you find that, yes, indeed, there in your watershed, there are some cold water fisheries designated for its trout fisheries. Looking at the criteria and kind of narrowing in on that use can help you kind of wade through the otherwise maybe overwhelming list of numbers. You might ask yourself, are all the important parameters there? So in this example, if you're a trout fisherman, you probably know trout need cold water, they need quite a bit of oxygen, they need some good habitat, places to hide in the stream, etc. Are all those types of things all addressed in your criteria? And then the harder question, if you're not a technical person, could be, are they protective enough? Is that dissolved oxygen standard enough to protect what you're concerned about? But that's where talking with others, with experts, even just going in and talking to the agency staff about how they selected those numbers, you can start to get wade into that technical world without as much pain and agony if you're focused in on something that you know a little bit about in your watershed. And lastly, even at the 101 level, I think as you look at your standards, you can really compare how those criteria vary from use to use and see if some uses are underprotected. An example of this, when I was first looking at the standards here in my home state of Utah, one of the things I noticed is we have 4, but we had 3 main classes that were different aquatic life use categories. They were 3A, 3B, and 3C. And the 3C waters, I noticed, only had a few of these criteria that were different, but they were dramatically different. And I couldn't see any justification for that. It was 3A is cold water, 3B is warm water, and this 3C category was just like other stuff, basically. And when I looked at what was missing, there were some pretty important things. Originally ammonia, they were exempted from anti-degradation. There were lots of things that didn't apply to that use. And when I started asking questions, I realized that those 3C waters were basically just stretches downstream of a wastewater treatment plant. There was no justification scientifically for having those different criteria. So I wasn't an expert in the technical details of the specific pollutants on that list, but it was enough to ask the question and start really saying, no, wait, why did these vary and how do they vary? And have that discussion with your state agency. So those are just some ways to kind of start, kind of interacting with the criteria. Don't let the long list that you'll see freak you out. Start with some things that you know a little bit about, whether that's fisheries or, swimming, kind of those primary contact recreation designations. They are mostly about bacteria. You could look at those, pick a piece and get a little familiar with it, or compare across the uses and see why things. So with that, I will pause again for questions. Looks like we've had some. Those are still conversations about the other stuff we were talking about here, like bacteria. If you want to *6, you can ask your question verbally, or again, use the chat function if you have any questions about criteria. Some typing going on, so I'm just going to hold off for a second here before we move. Oh, all of a sudden there's lots of typing. Okay, glad I waited. While we wait for those questions to pop up, I'll say this is one of my personal favorite creeks. This is Huntington Creek here in Utah, kind of in central Utah, a place I just discovered recently for fly fishing, and the fly fishing shop owner told me I can't tell anybody else, so I'm just announcing it on this national webinar. Wow, the questions, they must be long questions. People are still typing, but I'm not seeing anything pop up. Well, wait another second here and see if any of these pop up. Maybe you're typing to each other.
Hello, Merritt.
Yes.
Chris Morowski, Buffalo, New York. I had a question about E. coli levels. We test for E. coli, and it's hard to find a standard to compare it against because it's not, in New York, it's not, the creeks aren't designated as a beach use or use. So it's, I don't know if any other groups are having that same problem, but maybe you could touch on that.
I can touch on it, and I will say my disclaimer here is I don't know the specifics in New York, but your water bodies, even if they're not designated as beaches, they should all be designated as some sort of recreation unless the state's made the case through like a use attainability analysis that there's no way they can support swimming. Example might be like something really, really shallow. Sometimes they'll make a case that just physically you can't get your face in the water. But they have to have made that case. So they might not be designated as beaches, but there should be water quality criteria tied to either primary contact recreation and secondary, that split that I was mentioning about immersion versus wading, or some other, setup like that. I'm trying to think. I don't think I've ever looked at New York standards for this, but they have to have some kind of swimming designated use, and that would have a bacteria criteria associated with it. Most likely E. coli. Some states used to use fecal coliform, but they've, I think, almost all switched over to E. coli at this point. So, but I'd be happy to look at your standards with you and see if we could find that. Even if they're not designated as like some sort of official beach, that should apply to the vast majority of your waters. Does that jive at all with anything you know or have heard?
Yeah, New York is one of the only states that still does use fecal coliform.
Oh. Okay, so is that the root of your question? Is that you're measuring for something different than the standard?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, we're measuring for E. coli, but we want to find E. coli measures to compare, but our state uses fecal coliform. We want to use E. coli because we believe it's a better method.
I believe you're right. EPA does have national guidance. In fact, they're working on updating it right now on E. coli criteria. It's part of their oversight function. They issue these recommended criteria, and they have one for E. coli. There's actually some debate about their current proposal, but that might be one place to start. That would be the default for your state if they were to move to E. coli. They don't have to adopt US EPA's recommendations, but they either do that or make a case for why their different proposal is scientifically defensible and more appropriate. So if I were in your shoes, I might start with looking at what the federal criteria are. Have you ever looked at those?
Oh, we have. That's what we use for our personal standards or our company standards.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I just wondered if anybody else had problems.
No. Well, does anybody else on the line have a similar problem? Sound like it. I'm not seeing anybody chatting.
Okay, but thank you. That was very helpful.
Okay, so I've got one other question here related to criteria, it looks like. It says, if science establishes a parameter needed, for example, fish and copper, is there much difference state to state on criteria level or what's acceptable? Great question. I kind of alluded to part of this answer in the discussion there about E. coli. Generally speaking, for the majority of parameters, copper being a good example, US EPA establishes recommended criteria that is supposed to bring together the best science. Of course, there's always a challenge about best science and keeping that up to date. But they establish kind of a recommendation. And the states and tribes have a couple options. They can adopt kind of the EPA recommendation, or they can adopt a different criteria, but they have to make a case again for why that they need to do that. So it may be that they have a different method that they're using in terms of testing and analysis, et cetera. It may be that there's actually something different in their local waters that makes that parameter different. So, for example, it might be hardness issues, et cetera. That means scientifically they need to adjust the criteria to make it more appropriate to their state or region or even part of the state, kind of a localized criteria. But for whatever their reasoning is, they have to make a good case for why they would do something different than the recommended criteria. And again, US EPA reviews and approves those. An example is like right now in many states, states are working on establishing nutrient criteria, so for nitrogen and phosphorus. And those standards, those criteria might vary quite a bit across the country, but each state is trying to figure out, how does it vary in our state, even within our state, and how can we make a scientific case to US EPA for what those actual numbers for the criteria should be. So I hope that answers that question. If not, do a follow-up. But the idea is states have a couple options. They always have to be able to make a good case for anything they do that differs from the national recommendations. Okay, well, let's talk about the last piece of standards here. And this is the hardest one to do in a 101 because any 101 presentation just generates more questions in a way than answers. But it's really an important component of water quality standards, so I want to at least touch on it. We do whole webinars, again, just on this topic, and we have some additional resources that I'll point out at the end if you're interested in digging in more. So I haven't really used the raise hand function yet, but up at the top of your screen, there's a picture of a little guy with his hand raised. You can raise your hand. If you click on the arrow there, it gives you some options, and one of them is raise hand. So let's try this. How many of you have ever heard of the concept of anti-degradation? Use that raise hand function at the top of your screen if you have. Oh, a lot of people. Not about a third, I'd say, just in the very rough visual estimate here, maybe even a quarter, somewhere around there. Okay. Well, the basic concept of anti-degradation in the Water Quality Standards Program is the idea that where we have healthy, clean water, that's a valuable thing, and we, generally speaking, want to keep it that way. We don't want to just degrade all of our rivers and lakes and coastal waters around the country to the point where they're just barely meeting those water quality criteria we were talking about. So there's value in keeping that cleaner water and healthier systems there. So I'm going to walk through kind of the approach for anti-degradation a little quickly on this slide, and then we're going to walk through each of the three pieces in more detail. So the way the anti-degradation approach works is it establishes 3 tiers of protection. The first tier is kind of, again, a baseline. It's thinking about holding the line, and this brings that concept of existing uses back into play that we talked about earlier. So tier 1 says, if nothing else, if you are writing a pollution discharge permit or taking some other action that might degrade water quality, make it less clean and healthy, at the very base, you have to maintain and protect all your existing uses and the water quality to support those uses. So you can't write a permit, for example, that you know is going to put so much bacteria into a river stretch that the swimming hole downstream will violate water quality criteria and not be safe for people to use to swim. So we'll talk about that in more detail, but that's the baseline of protection. The tier 2 level of protection is the most complicated. We'll spend the most time here. That says we're going to limit degradation of higher quality waters. So where we have water quality that's better than just barely maintaining our uses, again, there's value to that, and we want to limit degradation there. And I'll talk about what limit means. And then the third tier of protection is kind of a different creature from the other two. It says we're going to strictly protect the quality of outstanding waters. You'll often hear these referred to as outstanding national resource waters or outstanding state resource waters. And in those, we're just not going to allow degradation, not just limit it. We're going to stop it. So let me talk about each of those in a little more detail. Tier 1, we've already talked about a little bit here. Again, it's that baseline of protection that says no matter what, you're not supposed to be allowed to take an action you know is going to wipe out an existing use, make that swimming hole unsafe, kill all the, bass in a warm water fishery, etc. So it's just that baseline of holding the line of degradation. You should never violate your water quality criteria. The second tier, again, is the more complicated one and where most of our waters probably end up, at least for some pollutants and parameters. And that is the high-quality water scenario. And what the regs say here is basically where you've got good quality water, where it's better than the minimum necessary to support, the fishable and swimmable goals, you need to protect that high quality of water. So maintain and protect that. But because, of course, this is part of a policy, which is part of a political world, there's a key word after that. It says, this shall be maintained and protected unless. And this is where we get to the idea of limiting degradation. And the unless basically establishes 3 tests. It says we're not going to allow, high quality water, good quality water to be degraded unless you prove first that there's no alternatives, no reasonable alternatives that are either not degrading or less degrading alternatives. You also have to prove that that activity is going to support important local social and economic development. So you might be getting lower quality water, but in exchange the community is getting something very important in terms of development. And you have to make sure that there's already good controls in place for other issues in the watershed, whether that's a point source or a non-point source problem. So for example, in the point source world, if you had a lot of facilities that weren't in compliance with their permits, that's not having the strongest controls in place for those permits. They'd have to be controlled, at least theoretically under this policy, before you'd be allowed to allow that degradation. So 3 tests listed here that are that unless language for the high quality waters. Important thing to note here, though, is that even in the scenarios where you do decide, yes, there's no alternative, it's got important economic and social development potential, and we've got good controls in place in the watershed for this, for other problems, you still have to protect existing uses. So that tier 1 level of protection, the baseline we talked about, is still in place. You still can't wipe out that swimming hole knowingly. So that's tier 2. I'm going to give you a little visual because this one can be a little hard to understand. A tier 2 situation would be like this example. So I'm using a generic pollutant here I call gluck, just so we don't argue over the details of any pollutant. So let's say your state has established a water quality criteria for gluck, and it's a maximum allowable amount of 10 milligrams per liter at any time in the water column. And when you go out and you monitor for gluck in the stream, you find, hey, we're actually at 4 milligrams per liter. We've got pretty good quality for gluck here. It's that increment between the 4 and the 10 that Tier 2 is focused on protecting. So it's saying there's value to the fact that that water is cleaner than just barely meeting the standard. It's what you might call assimilative capacity in that bracketed area, and that's what we're protecting for. And you wouldn't be allowed to put, to have that 4 milligrams creep up to 6 or 8 or 9 unless you went through that Tier 2 process of proving there's no alternatives. It's important for local social and economic development, and other protections are in place. So that's, again, kind of a whirlwind tour of Tier 2. If you're looking at wastewater treatment discharge permits or industrial permits, et cetera, a lot of the universe you would be working in would be this Tier 2 kind of protection. And then the third category is a slightly different creature in terms of protection. So the third tier of protection, Tier 3, is often called outstanding national resource waters, or some states like mine that hate the idea that the national government exists, they're just called national state resource waters or natural resource waters. There might be other names. But the idea here is there's some waters that are so special that we're just going to hold the line. We're not going to allow any degradation, even with the Tier 2 kind of tests. We're just not going to allow it to happen. You can see here some of the regulatory language. And what they talk about basically is waters of exceptional recreational or ecological significance. So, the example you see here, national and state parks might be for recreation. Ecological might be special species, whether endangered or otherwise special species. Just high quality ecologically, like reference streams, if you all are familiar with that concept, could fit in under here. The idea is these are special water bodies that we actually designate as the Tier 3 kind of water bodies, and then we hold the line on water quality. We don't allow new point source discharges, for example, that would degrade that water quality. So that's Tier 3 again, kind of a whirlwind tour. The one other point to make here, actually, I think that somebody mentioned this in chat. That West Virginia is the example here. It says now has Tier 2.5 for near pristine waters. A lot of states have something that they either call or that functions as a Tier 2.5. It's kind of between Tier 2 and Tier 3. So, for example, here in Utah, we have several what I would call Tier 2.5 waters. And in those waters, you can have, like, say, a new point source discharge come in, but they have to discharge at background levels. They can't degrade water quality, but they can discharge to the water. Whereas in our Tier 3, there's no discharge at all. So there's kind of a little bit of tweaking there. The federal regulation just has these 3 tiers, but the states have come up with other alternatives that are kind of between the two. One thing I will mention here on this slide about Tier 3 waters that may or may not be true depending on how your state established anything like a Tier 2.5 is notice that this language in front of you says nothing about pristine waters. Outstanding national resource waters or state waters, depending on what your state calls them, do not need to have pristine water quality. Do not let anybody tell you, like, well, it violates for bacteria, so even though it's a really great fishery, there's no way we're going to consider it for Tier 3 protection. The case that you should have to make is exceptional recreational or ecological significance. Now, some states do not do that, so as a reality check, that can be a hard case to make. But that is the vision behind these ONRWs. It's about that recreational and ecological significance, not some kind of holy grail of pristine water quality, which is increasingly rare, unfortunately, in most of our states as development, et cetera, happens. So I wanted to give you an example. This is really text-heavy. Sorry, but I picked this Indiana example because if you look at the numbers down the side, the 1, 2, 3, you can see very easily the 3 tiers of protection because this very closely mimics the federal language, which lots of states do. So in Indiana, if you look at Section 2, little number 1, that is establishing kind of the Tier 1 type of protections. This 2 establishes Tier 2. And then number 3 is talking about outstanding, they call them outstanding state resource waters, but it's Tier 3 protection, and then actually lists 3 waters that they've designated as protected. So that's just an example of how it might look in your regulations. A lot of states these days have fleshed this out quite a bit more, so it's not quite so short and sweet, wouldn't fit on a PowerPoint slide. And it's important to note that what you're looking at here is something called the anti-degradation policy. States are also supposed to have a policy, an implementation procedure that talks about how they're going to make this work. So questions about, say, Tier 2, what does important social and economic development mean, and how do you prove or disprove that? Those types of things are supposed to be spelled out in an associated implementation procedure. And more states are developing those. Some of them are still quite sketchy, but if you look at your state water quality standards, there's a good chance you're going to see some kind of further development of these ideas, or they may be working on developing that because it's an area of kind of increasing attention. Okay, so a question here, it says, what about religious or ceremonial significance? Going back, I think, probably to this language of recreational or ecological significance. This is what the federal reg says. State or tribal rules could vary. You could say in your state or tribal rules, exceptional recreational, cultural, or ecological significance. Or you can make the case, even I would say, even if your state mimics this language, I think you could still make the case for the significance of those types of activities. It seems blasphemous to call it recreational significance, but if I were wanting to protect those types of waters, I would still make a case under even this type of language. But you might want to look at how your state or tribal government has interpreted this, because they may have tweaked it to include those types of concerns. Okay, so taking action on anti-degradation, again, this is a little bit more of a wonky and intimidating at times part of water quality standards, but it's pretty fundamental if you want to protect your watershed. It can be a really powerful tool. So some of the 101 kind of entry-level questions or things to poke around in, I'd suggest, is checking to see if your state has an anti-degradation implementation procedure or policy. As I discussed, a lot of states will have something that very much, just lays out those 3 tiers, or in some cases 4 with 2.5 protection. But the nuts and bolts of how it really works is going to be in this implementation area. See if you can find one. If you don't have one, it'd be really great to talk to your state about getting one created. If you do have one, can you understand how it works? Do they actually address the questions that you would need to answer in order to understand how to make the case for or against degradation in your watershed? Secondly, just if you're somebody that's already reviewing discharge permits or other activities that should be using this anti-degradation idea, always ask if they've done an anti-degradation review. Have they, in most cases, it's going to be that Tier 2 review where they look for alternatives, socioeconomic importance, etc. Ask if they've done it, ask to see it, provide your own local information about, the kind of the social and economic downsides, for example, or other alternatives you might know about. In a lot of cases, you're going to find either it wasn't done or it was done in a very, very cursory manner, and there's lots that a watershed group or a river group could contribute. And then lastly, and maybe more fun, think about your watershed, and if there are Tier 3 water candidates, do you have those waters of really, recreational or ecological significance, or even cultural or religious, as we talked about, that you might want to make the case for as the Tier 3 or ONRW waters that we talked about earlier. There's a question about ONRW that goes back to this slide. It's shorthand for outstanding national resource water, or in some cases, again, just outstanding resource water or outstanding state resource water. So do you have any of those Tier 3 water candidates in your watershed? Would be one key question. And do you want to make a case for one? So with that, I will see if there are any questions before we go to the resources slide and kind of some suggestions. You can star 6 to unmute or type away. Maybe while people are typing, I'll go ahead and put up that the resources slide. Although this is my favorite picture. This is a dock at my family cabin in northern Michigan. I think it's the best dock ever. So resources here as people are typing their questions. Few things to follow up. We have an online Clean Water Act course. You can see the address there, just cleanwateract.org, that has 10, I think it is, lessons about different components of the Clean Water Act, including water quality standards and anti-degradation. So you can go there, if you have some refresher stuff that was in this webinar, but you'll also have some additional materials, a lot of information for digging deeper, and some examples and stories from around the country on water quality standards, but again, also on other components of the Act. If you want to look at your own water quality standards and start asking some of the questions that we talked about in the action slides, if you go to the address listed here, US EPA keeps a library of water quality standards, and this includes state and tribal standards. And they keep it pretty up to date. It's a pretty good resource. You can always be, stuff that's been updated, but it seems to be a pretty good place to go for one-stop shop. You can see your standards. You can do things like look up the designated uses and how they're defined. You can look at criteria, see if you've got an anti-degradation implementation procedure, all through that kind of portal there. The other thing I wanted to mention in terms of next steps is we have a follow-up webinar to this one coming up on March 21st called Biocriteria in the Real World. And this is looking at one component of water quality standards, in fact, one type of water quality criteria, which is increasingly under discussion and being applied in the states, and that's biocriteria. That's getting at measuring the health of the aquatic community, whether it's macroinvertebrates, little bugs, or fish, or other things like plant life. We have a great speaker, Susan Davies, who's really the expert, or one of the key experts on this issue. She's retired from the state of Maine, where they were one of the early states to establish biocriteria. And she's going to walk people through an intermediate session on biocriteria, assuming that you know some of this 101 and are ready to look at this in more detail. And we also, I provided this other link because we do have some recorded webinars available that are kind of archived there that cover associated Clean Water Act issues. And this webinar will be there within, say, a week or 10 days